Good evening, everybody. My name's E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are really excited tonight to be celebrating One Drop, and we're here with the author, Dr. Yaba Blay, and our Karis Circle board chair, Dr. Susanna Morris. Susanna is also the host of the Black Feminist Book Club at Karis, and a constant and frequent moderator for us, which we love. So I'm going to actually introduce Susanna first. So Dr. Susanna Morris is an associate professor of literature, media, and communication at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She is co-founder and contributing writer for the popular feminist blog, The Crunk Feminist Collective. Her first book is Close Kin and Distant Relatives, The Paradox of Respectability in Black Women's Literature. And her most recent books are the anthology, The Crunk Feminist Collection, which was co-edited with Brittany Cooper and Robin Boylorn, and a short story collection of horror written by Black women, co-edited with Kendra D. Brooks and Linda Addison. Morris is also series editor, along with Kendra D. Brooks, of the book series New Sons, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Speculative. She is currently at work on her latest academic book project, which explores depictions of Black women vampires, Afrofuturism, and feminism. So welcome, Susanna.
Thank you.
And we're here tonight to celebrate the work of Dr. Yaba Blay. Dr. Blay is a scholar activist, public speaker, and cultural consultant whose scholarship, work, and practice centers the lived experiences of Black women and girls, with a focus on identity and body politics and beauty practices. Lauded by O Magazine for her social media activism, Dr. Blay has launched several viral campaigns, including Locks of Love, #PrettyPeriod, and #ProfessionalBlackGirl. Her multi-platform digital community, and #ProfessionalBlackGirl, her multi-platform digital community. She has appeared on CNN, BET, MSNBC, the BBC, and NPR, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, Ebony, Essence, Fast Company, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Color Lines, and The Root. A thought leader on Black racial identity, colorism, and beauty politics, Dr. Blay is a globally sought-after speaker and consultant, and earned a Master of Arts and PhD in African American Studies with distinction and a graduate certificate in Women's Studies from Temple University. She also holds a Master of Education and Counseling Psychology from the University of New Orleans. So welcome, Dr. Blay. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you.
I want to also welcome and thank our Auburn Avenue Research Library research librarian friend who is already hot in the chat, bringing the resources. I want to let folks know, if you're new to this partnership with Karis and Auburn Avenue Research Library, we're going to be getting a lot of really wonderful supplementary material in the chat. Just trust that that will all be there at the end. So we're going to encourage you to stay with us in the main conversation. And then at the end, please go back and visit all of that material. The Auburn Avenue Research Library is currently closed for browsing, but is open online, and they really want to help you pursue your own academic projects and your own interests. So you can make an appointment with a research librarian to follow up on anything you see here tonight. You can also just go browse the collections online. Their website's amazing, and you're going to find all kinds of stuff that's going to pique your interest tonight. So pay attention to those links at the end of the night. This link will stay live. You can revisit it anytime. But for now, I'm just going to pop out of here, and let's get this conversation started.
Yay. Hi, twin.
What's up, twin?
So Susanna and I have the exact same birthday, 12/12. So you got two Sagittarius in the house.
Fiery. I mean, just get ready.
But thank y'all for joining us here to celebrate the re-release of my book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race. Yes. Which has been acquired and re-released on Beacon Press. And it's just been a whirlwind the last couple of days. So thank you all for your support. Before Susanna and I get to chatting, I want to give a brief presentation just to give you some context and some background on how I came to do this work. So I'm going to share my screen. Y'all see that? Yeah? Okay. So this book, One Drop, Shifting the Lens on Race, focuses on Black racial identity and skin color politics. And in many ways, it represents a conversation about Blackness and considers questions of who's Black, who's not, and who cares. Rather than tell you the specific details of the book, because of course, I would love for you all to buy your own copy, I just want to give you some context and some background information to understand how I got here, understand why it is I chose to take on this particular project. So if you listen to my bio, you know that my work centers on the lived experiences of Black people. And when I say Black people, capital B, I'm referring to people of African descent all over the world. So for me, Blackness is a global identity, one that not only reflects race, but also reflects culture. And within my work, I focus much of my attention on colorism and global skin color politics. Straightforward, right? We'll flash back to 2010. I was on a panel with this woman, Rosa Clemente, hip hop activist, community organizer, and 2008 vice presidential candidate. And we were on a panel together at the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York City. We were there to talk about global skin color politics and colorism across the diaspora. And for as learned and as well-versed as I thought I was at the time, I found myself distracted, taken aback each time Rosa self-identified as a, quote, Black Puerto Rican woman from the South Bronx, end quote. And so, I mean, okay, yes, I know that Puerto Ricans are of some African descent. I had been to Puerto Rico a few times, but I certainly hadn't met any Puerto Ricans who claimed their Black identity. Probably because of where I grew up. Where I grew up, there wasn't a large Latinx community, and there certainly wasn't an Afro-Latinx community. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and there you were either Black, white, or Creole. And in my experience, folks who had the privilege of identifying as Creole did. And as far as I was concerned, they were just saying that they were Creole, so they didn't have to say that they were Black. In my experience, many Creoles rejected Blackness. In my experience, many Creoles rejected me. I remember not being invited to the birthday party of one of my very best friends because she said her mama said I was too Black. And then later, when I was an adult, I wasn't invited to the wedding of a colleague for the very same reason. So as far as I was concerned, Creoles didn't want to be Black and didn't have to be. And so anytime I encountered one or I encountered someone who looked like one, I already knew what it was. I already knew who they were or who I thought they were. But in meeting Rosa, I started questioning a lot. I started rethinking what I knew, not only about folks who look a particular way, but about Blackness in general. And so I started this project. I wanted to investigate what I was then calling the other side of Blackness. So I interviewed over 70 people representing 25 different countries and countries of origin. They ranged in age from 21 to 103 years old. 58 of them and their portraits are included in the book. The book not only features short narratives that I wrote based upon our interviews, but they also feature portraits of each of the contributors. I want to give a shout out to Noelle Théard, who's the director of photography on the project. She actually created most of these portraits herself. Now, while contributors use a variety of terms to self-identify, they all see themselves as part of the larger racial and cultural group generally referred to as Black folks. All of them have had their experience of having their identity called into question simply because of how they look. And most of them have been asked, what are you? Or the more politically correct, where are you from? The very first question that I asked each of the contributors in our conversations was, how do you identify racially and or culturally? Black Puerto Rican, Black from Louisiana, Black, Latina. Black and or mixed race. Mixed and or Black. Black of mixed heritage. Afro-Cuban and or Black. African American. Black. African. Mixed and or Jamaican. Black. Black American Muslim. Black. Ethiopian and Black. Part of the purpose of this book is to examine how it is that people see themselves, particularly how it is that we as Black people come to identify and define ourselves. Historically, this graphic represents what it is meant to be Black by law. In the history of the United States, a Black person has been defined as any person with any known Black African ancestry. Although this definition has been referred to as the one Black ancestor rule, the traceable amount rule, and the rule of hypodescent, it is more popularly known as the one drop rule, meaning that one single solitary drop of Black blood, of African blood, is enough to render a person Black. Said differently, the one drop rule holds that a person with any trace of Black African ancestry, however small or visible or invisible, I should say, cannot be considered white. They must be considered Black. Understand this. This rule, if not the history of race, race was created to protect whiteness. Whiteness was defined as pure. Blackness, therefore, was something that would taint that purity. You should know that no other ethnic group is defined or counted according to the one drop rule. You should also know that the one drop rule is characteristically American, meaning that in no other nation or society does this rule have any applicability or even make any sense, for that matter. In fact, in many places, for a person of African descent, any one drop of anything else is enough to render that person something else. So looking at this graphic, you can see that we're talking about looking into your family lineage back 5 generations. And that if one person, even way back in that 5th generation, is Black, then you too are Black, at least according to the law. In the introduction of the book, I map out the history of how it is that the United States came to adopt such a specific and seemingly quantitative definition of Black identity. And it was important for me to provide that context first before providing contributors' narratives and portraits, because I want to push us to think critically about how it is that we as Black people come to identify and define ourselves. Many of us have accepted this one drop rule as our own without question, right? But the truth is we didn't create it. Because of this, many others of us reject the one drop rule and resent definitions of Blackness that do not originate with Black people. So once we come to know and understand the history of race in this country, my question is, does that necessarily mean that we should reject it altogether? And if the answer is yes, my next question is, how then might we quantify Blackness as a group identity? How then might we qualify Blackness as a group identity? Who would be Black and why? Or better stated, who would be Black and how? A large part of what I'm attempting to do with this project is to get us to reimagine Blackness. It's not my goal to tell people who they are. It's not my goal to tell you how to identify. It is my goal, however, that we begin to question and understand the politics of identity, that we begin to question and understand the politics of racial identity, and that we begin to understand and question the politics of Blackness. Thank you. I'm back. Where you at, twin? There you are.
I just wanted your beautiful face and your slides to be the focus. So now I'm back. That was a really awesome framing and introduction to your work. And I want to start at the beginning. I'm really interested in the initial stories that you tell, but that preface the contributors' stories and portraits. In particular, I want to talk about, I was gonna call her our girl, but she's not. Susie Guillory Phipps. She's somebody grandma, who was 132nd Black, according to her, and she did not know. And she finds out, right, that she is Black according to the law, right? And if she's alive, she may still very well be Black and angry about it. And then you tell these stories of President Obama and his identification as African American, and Halle Berry, who is Black and biracial and has had children with non Black people and the sort of complications of that. So I'm interested in these stories that you preface. Not only do you do an excellent job of giving us that history, and that chart is so amazing, but also these very like stories of real people. Why begin us there? What are the stories of Susan Guillory Phipps, Barack Obama, and Nala? I don't know what her last name is, but Halle Berry's baby. Tell us about Blackness.
Well, I thought it would be interesting to just talk about some other real world happenings. I wanted to start with Susie Guillory Phipps because I know what it did to me when I first heard the story. Like, wow, right? Because essentially the story is, and you want to show, can you flip to that picture and show the people what she looks like? So she's from Louisiana, lived her life, and she says, she's quoted in the Times-Picayune newspaper as saying, I was raised white. I grew up in an all-white community. I've been white all my life. So what had happened was Susie Guillory Phipps, for whatever reason, didn't have her passport. She was traveling. She went to apply to get a passport. No, for whatever reason, she didn't have a copy of her birth certificate. And so in order to get her passport, she had to get her birth certificate. And she was listed as colored on her birth certificate. And of course, it blew her mind and rocked her world. And she's like, I can't be colored. Y'all made a mistake. And they're like, no, this is what the paper says. And so she sued the Louisiana Board of Vital Statistics, whoever does the birth certificate. She sued them and lost. She sued all the way to the Supreme Court of the state of Louisiana and lost. And so, like you said, if she's still alive, by law, she is considered what they were then calling colored, what we would now call Black or African American. And so when I read that story, it immediately made me think of passing. It made me think, particularly in Louisiana, right? There are folks who, again, based upon this one drop rule, we say they are passing for white because the law says you're Black, but you're passing for white. But again, on appearances, particular folks don't know. What's interesting, just to plug in here, I talk to my friends from New Orleans about this all the time. And maybe we'll get into this because when we talk about colorism and skin color politics, we're talking about the spectrum of light skin versus dark skin. But everybody's perception of light skin and dark skin is different. And I know mine is very different because I was raised in Louisiana, right? So for example, Susanna, if I took you to Ghana with me right now, they will call you Obroni. Obroni means white, right? To them, light skin, no question, right? If you were to go to a city, probably that, Baltimore is a very Black city. They might not think you so light. You might be brown, and so who you call light skin and
Which is how I identify. I do not identify as light skinned. I am brown. I'm going to put that out there. I was only light skinned for 2 years in the 80s.
Yes. And so the perception is different. I mean, I think about it, I'm not going to get off track, but when I think about it, I think about even the emojis that people choose for themselves. And I'm like, girl, you're not that light, or you're not that dark. It's just interesting how we see ourselves and or how we want to project ourselves into the world. So anyway, I start with her story just to get us thinking about like, who is in charge, who is in control of naming us, of codifying us, of putting us in the box. She herself did not have control over that. The state of Louisiana did. I talk about Bob Marley, right? Whose mother is Black, father, is white. And I don't know. I think Jamaicans might have a different experience. You can tell us about that. But from my experience, I don't know people questioning Bob Marley's Blackness. Right? It's not a question, right? But he is literally, quote unquote, if you use the language, biracial or mixed. But Bob wasn't having any of that. Bob said not only was he Black, he said he was an African, right? And then we have President Obama, whose mother is white, father is Kenyan, Black, also technically biracial, also technically mixed. In this current moment, you know, when he was running for the presidency, there were some white folks who were questioning, who was he? Your boy Trump, asking for his birth certificate, so on and so forth. But for most Black folks, not questioning his Blackness. But what's interesting to me, and maybe we'll talk about this, if you compare Bob Marley and Barack Obama, tell me if I'm wrong. My lived experience, when people are technically mixed race, there's a difference when your mother is Black. There are less questions when your mama is Black. I think of Yara Shahidi. So. Ain't nobody questioning Yara Shahidi's Blackness, right? Because they look to the mother, right? As opposed to Barack Obama, who has a white mother. So just something to think about. But then the story of Halle Berry was interesting because she herself is biracial, right? And then she has a child or children. I don't know if she has more children, but at the time, Nala, she has two. At the time, Nala's father was a white man. And I think it was an interview in Ebony. It was an interview somewhere, and they asked what she considered her daughter. And Halle was like, she Black. Her mama Black, she Black. It wasn't any more conversation than that. And so I just put those stories out there to just get people's minds rolling about how it is that we come to identify people, how it is that people come to identify themselves. Now let's look at the law.
That's a really helpful framing. And I want to go to something that you say on page 39, because, you know, as professors, we want to talk about textual evidence. But before we go there, I want to talk about Mrs. Phipps, because something in the milk ain't clean. Because here on page 2, you write, let me find it. Many of Phipps' ancestors were classified as, quote, quadroons, mulattoes, and colored up until the time of her birth in 1934. And during the court case, one of her first cousins, now I don't know if she didn't know this cousin just popped up, but one of her first cousins testified that her uncle, Phipps' father, quote, was a colored man, just like the rest of them. So she didn't know.
And so here we go. So when we think about the history of passing, right? If we think about, you know, the famous movie Imitation of Life, what folks had to do to pass was to completely remove themselves from any part of their family or community who could identify that history. Can nobody know your grandmother, great grandmother, or whomever is Black? Because the gig is up, right?
Right.
And so when I just presented the information. I'm just the messenger.
You presented it, and I read it, and I thought, yeah, she does not invite him to the family. She does not, you know, the cookout, or she probably calls it a barbecue. I don't know. She uses different language, and she doesn't invite that cousin. But that cousin was like, I will go to the court case, and I will reveal the truth, because you've been acting like you don't know us, but we know you. Yeah, and we know who you are.
Some beef, right? And so for me, that's why it's like, Susie, were you surprised, boo? Okay.
She wasn't, but her husband was.
She was.
I'll say that.
Right.
Flabbergasted. Like, this is not, you know.
But again, it was so interesting genetically. One of her kids could have popped up with a little kink to that hair and would have told
generation. Mm-hmm.
You know? So yeah, I mean, who knows? That's her story.
Yeah. I don't claim that, Susie, but that's okay. So I want to talk about, you use the language, this is on page 39 in the introduction, use the language of inviting us to shift the lens, which I think is really interesting. And you sort of use that language towards the end of your introduction just now, getting us to think about why we use the kind of language that we use. So in an era where folks are perhaps rightfully insisting on racial gatekeeping, right? In an era of, you already know where I'm going. In an era of Rachel Dolezal's and Jessica Krug, I had to look the child name up because I already tried to forget her once I learned the story. The Kardashians and rampant blackfishing on social media and in life, what would you say to Black folk who are listening or interested in your book, who are like, actually, we need to adhere to strict phenotype gatekeeping because folks are trying to be us, they're trying to infiltrate us, they want the Blackness, but they don't want the blues, you know? So how would you sort of engage with that kind of person who's wrestling with a kind of trauma, right, around folks wanting to appropriate Blackness?
It's a difficult conversation to have. I've attempted
Yeah.
to have it, particularly with like students, you know, because what's interesting generationally, not to age myself, but younger folks, they cut and clear. You ain't Black, moving on, right? And so then when I try to engage them, well, why aren't they Black? You know, they actually find it hard to find the language. For me, I think, again, I don't want to put myself in a position to tell people who they are. I feel like the cases that we hear about, the Rachel Dolezals and the Jessica LaBamba or whatever she was calling herself, they are the ones who get outed, right? They're the ones that are just out on Front Street. And so we have to address that. But very much like you said, you want our rhythm, but not our blues, right? And so, of course, you feel offended by that, given the experiences that we have. I don't want to negate that at all. I'm going to put that over here. But again, when we close the door and kick them out of the cookout and we're talking to ourselves, what are the parameters that we're going to use, y'all? If we find the need to define Blackness, how are we going to define it? Like, and I don't know that because Blackness is so diverse and vast, even I would have difficulty saying, here are the check marks, here are the checkpoints. Are we only going to go based upon what people look like? Are we going to pull out the 5-generation chart? Are we going to adhere to the 1-drop rule or not? And also, the way I think about Blackness, bigger than race, right? There are some Black people that we might want to kick out based upon their political, you see what I'm saying? Like, how do you see Black? There are lots of Black people who, agents of white supremacy themselves, don't like Black people. They could be Black as me, but in terms of how they move through the world, right? And so for me, and again, maybe I'm too idealistic in that way. For me, in this moment, I'm more concerned with how you do, how you think, how you act, work, and live on behalf of Black people than how you look. Again, not excusing the Rachel Dolezals at all, right? But to say, we just have to keep these things in mind and be careful about the ways in which we are going to construct the parameters of Blackness, because lots of people are going to get in, but some of them we don't want. If we throwing people out, I can name a few people that need to get thrown out too.
Daniel Cameron, today. Don't stop. Don't try to collect nothing. Just
go.
Beat it.
Every Black person with a red hat on, you got to go too. Right? But again, if we're going to limit it to Blackness, but even bigger than that, right? And I'm not being facetious when I ask this question. What is it that we're protecting? I'm not saying there's nothing to protect, but again, let us be clear. What is it that we're protecting? And the thing that troubles me is oftentimes what folks are protecting is the right to claim an oppressed identity, meaning they can't be seen as Black because then they're going to get all of the things that are set aside for us as minorities, right? And again, not to say that that's not important things to think about, but also, who else are we? Who else are we besides folks who have been enslaved and colonized? Who else are we besides folks who are constantly oppressed within this white supremacist structure? We have to be very careful about how we frame our identities, right? Because yes, those are experiences that we have. That is the political space that we are in, like it or not. But we have and are so much more, no? Just questions.
Yeah, I think those are interesting questions because I think the difference, and I'm just gonna like play
Sure.
fast and dirty with language, but there's not that Black folk, as we sort of have understood ourselves to be Black across the diaspora, especially those of us in the West, right? Like folks in the Americas, there's something we created Blackness in a particular kind of way, right? Or we recreated Blackness. There's something I think for us to divest from in the ways that white folk have to divest from whiteness. Like, what is whiteness? Whiteness is a thing that they created when they gave up their European indigeneity,
Mhm.
right? Whereas our people, you might come from wherever you come from and land in Jamaica or New Orleans or Bahia or what have you, right? We have a lot left. We didn't have to give up all the things to be people, right? But white supremacy invites white people and those who want to be agents of white supremacy to give up core parts of their humanity,
Mhm.
right? And blackness is richer than that,
Mhm.
right? So
Mhm.
it's slavery and colonization, but it doesn't. Someone in the chat is talking about how our history didn't begin in slavery. It did not, right? And it's very expansive, and
Mhm.
that's a fundamental difference between whiteness and blackness,
Absolutely.
right? So, and not conceding that territory, I think the language that you use, that like that one drop and the hypodescent and all that, that's language that we've been given. What happens when we sort of own language and sort of take it back in particular kinds of ways? I think that's that shifting of the lens. I see the camera language that you're using, but also, that linguistic turn is interesting too.
Yes, because again, what I'm saying is I'm cautioning us, I'm asking us to think critically and carefully before we start gatekeeping in a particular way, because there are going to be implications for whatever laws we lay down, whatever rules we make. Because if we go simply on genetics or appearances, think of how many Black folks we don't have to give up. Who will we be celebrating this Black History Month? Can you still celebrate W.E.B. Du Bois? Can you still celebrate Barack Obama? Can you still celebrate Adam Clayton Powell, Eartha Kitt, Dorothy Dandridge? You know what I'm saying? Like, historically, a lot of folks who didn't have options to be anything else were ours and did good work on our behalf. We got to give them up if we redefine Blackness in a particular way now. Maybe folks want to. I don't know. But again, more questions. What are the implications of the definitions that we are going to construct for Blackness?
Right. Yeah.
What do you think about?
I'm thinking about us as two people with identities outside of the United States, like connections, right? Like my family's from Jamaica and the Dominican Republic and other places across the Caribbean, and you're Ghanaian American and from New Orleans, right? I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and other places, lived all over. And so I'm interested in, I could talk about some of my experience, but I'm interested in how your experience, you sort of already talked about New Orleans as being formative to your understandings of race. And New Orleans, I think, and Louisiana more generally, but New Orleans specifically is a particular kind of place, you know what I mean? And so I'm interested to hear kind of your journey and how it informs your intellectual work, but also show your personal understandings of this project.
Well, I mean, New Orleans is part and parcel of why I'm interested in colorism. It was my experience. I knew that I was dark skinned before I knew how to spell my own middle name. I knew that I was not only dark skinned, but I was also African. My parents spoke with accents. I came to school probably smelling different because of my mother's food. You know what I mean? My hair was different. In Ghana, little girls all wear very short haircuts until they go to college. Like, that's how we identify little girls. So my mother didn't know how to do no hair. So if I go back to that school picture, she probably had newspaper rubber bands in my hair. She was trying. My hair didn't do what everybody else's hair did. She was trying. I was marked differently. And so there's also a part when we come to this conversation about identity politics, like the first generation experience is interesting and hard, right? Because at home, in my home, it was Ghana. Parents spoke to me in Twi. We ate different foods. We listened to different music. Their community that they constructed were all kinds of immigrants from other African, countries as well. So I grew up with Kenyans and Nigerians, like we formed our own communities because they felt the need to form a safe space. And as a child, that's where I spent a lot of time, but also vacillating between that space and my Black American friends, and so occupying this middle space where, if I go to Ghana, my cousins let me know all the time that I was American. And then if I'm on the playground in New Orleans, they let me know that I'm African. So what does that mean? And so for me, if I'm quite honest, in a lot of ways, this work and my commitment to Blackness as a global identity helps me find my home, helps me find my place. And so when I move through the Black world, I'm the one who's going to draw connections because I don't want us to separate ourselves. We can't afford to be like, oh, Susanna, you Jamaican. So do you know how many Ghanaians were dropped off in Jamaica? Do you know how much Ghanaian culture I can identify when I go to Jamaica? Jamaica feels like home to me. Period.
We're cousins. We're cousins. I mean,
period. As does Nigeria. You feel me? As does New Orleans. Because culturally, bigger than the race, bigger than this, what do? How do we think about God and our relationship to God? How do we think about food? We all season in food. There's going to be some pepper in there too. Okay. How we cook our food, our relationship to each other, our relationship to children, like culturally, we move very much the same. And for me, that's been so affirming to some sense of normalcy that I'm not distant and different from all of these people. I'm actually more like everyone than I'm not, And so because I think that's been so powerful for me and my sense of groundedness is why I encourage us, all of us, to think about ourselves connected to a larger global community rather than saying, I'm Jamaican, I'm Nigerian. Like Blackness is the bigger umbrella. So many of us fall under it. So yes, please rep your set. I'm Ghanaian all day long. And also I'm Black. And also I'm West African. And also I'm diasporan. So like anytime I travel to a space, I actually make it a point to go and see where the people live. Because I don't want to stay at the resort. Just like New Orleans, don't stay in the French Quarter. That's not New Orleans. That's the New Orleans that makes them money. New Orleans is outside of that. Same with Jamaica. I'm leaving the resort. I'm eating food off of the roadside because it's the best kind. I'm making friends with my Uber and my taxi drivers. I'm talking to the sisters at the market because they really going to tell you where to get your hair done. You see what I'm saying? Like you find your people and you also act like they're your people. So I'm not going somewhere and being like, oh, I'm American. Leave that be, And so, yeah, my experience is absolutely how I come to understand Blackness the way that I do. I can't afford, because what would I be? I'm going to only connect with folks who are also Ghanaian American. How often am I going to see myself? How large is my community going to be in New Orleans? Hell, in Philadelphia, you know what I mean? And so I just don't think we can afford to single out identities in that way. And also that's not how it works. Because at the end of the day, did the police care where Amadou Diallo was from before they murdered him?
They didn't ask. They just saw the wallet and said it was a gun. I mean, it's so interesting. It makes me think of a conversation I had years ago with my own father, who is a Black Dominican. I don't know that he understands he's Black. Questions that need answers. But
about your people, please.
But I remember he said to me, he's lived in Puerto Rico, and he said, I don't understand your mother as a Black person, why she would live in the United States. And he said Black as if he was talking about
somebody else.
Another person. And I thought, Negro, you're Black. We all live in the United States. Puerto Rico is a colony. So what happens in the book is there are all these stories of folks from across the Caribbean, folks from various parts of the continent, folks who are Afro-European, sort of grappling with those questions. So I'm really interested in, like, when you had these conversations with people and they said, well, I'm African. There's one brother in here who is like part Asian, and he says, I'm Black. And I flipped to the picture and I'm like, okay, I believe whatever you say.
Yes.
Howsoever.
Yes.
Right. How people sort of, especially across the diaspora, come to understand themselves. So I'm interested in how those conversations went,
They were amazing to me.
Yeah.
They were amazing. And of course, the book is only but part of the conversation. Many of them wanted to talk more, because what ends up happening is many of them had never had the opportunity to have a conversation like this in a safe space without being judged, without being asked 11 questions, for clarification. Like, I'm just asking you to tell me who you are. I'm asking you to tell me about your experiences. I'm acknowledging that people see you as different. How does that make you feel? What is it that you want people to know about you? How is it? Because again, what's interesting to me, nobody's going to ask me, what are you? You know, they might ask me where I'm from. Interestingly enough, they do that often, but they're not going to ask me to define or defend my Blackness. It's a given. So I don't have to come up with a definition. I don't have to come up with an explanation. If somebody asks me, I will probably look at them like they're crazy, right? Like, don't you see it? But for all of these folks, they've had to have these conversations over and over and over and over again. They've had to explain to people what makes them Black. And so I was interested, again, if we're going to make this move towards understanding Blackness, getting to a space where we come to define Blackness, I would love to hear how you define Blackness, since you have to do it all the time. What's also very interesting and what felt very empowering for me is that despite their appearance, or maybe because of their appearance, right? Many of them have very strong and clear political ideations of Blackness. Like, they're clear on, like, this is who I identify as my people, and this is how I'm going to move through the world on behalf of my people. Nobody was talking about Blackness like it was a curse, like I have no choice to be Black. You know, it wasn't like, well, the one drop rule says I'm Black, so that's why I'm Black. No, you know? And so I think for me, it was affirming in a lot of ways for me, you know, to have conversations. Because again, in my experience, I was used to people rejecting Blackness.
Right.
You know, again, like if they could be, and listen, if they got to be something else, they was going to run away from Blackness quick. So I'm looking at them like, you're running towards Blackness? Tell me about that. Why you want to be Black? You don't have to be. But no, they want to be seen as Black. I think the thing that was a common thread for many of them is the pain that comes with being rejected by the people who you ride for. Mm-hmm. Or to have people reject you based upon how you look. And so, yeah, the conversations were dope.
I mean, I've been with this book since the beginning, since the first iteration. So, you know, just rereading the stories and thinking about where we are today, particularly in this post-Obama context, right? I think it's just so interesting the way that these folks are able to articulate themselves in terms of both race, but ethnicity, geography, all those kinds of things. It's really fascinating. There are already questions in the question box. I want to ask one more thing before I open it up. Something that has struck me about this book is you include folks who have albinism and vitiligo, right? So it's not simply folks who are racially ambiguous or quote unquote mixed race, or you're sort of I would say expanding how we understand Blackness. And I think Black folk, particularly, we've been talking about Michael Jackson. You got a light-skinned friend look like Michael Jackson. You got a dark-skinned friend look like Michael Jackson, right? And so how we come to understand Blackness, when I don't necessarily want to use the term disability, but maybe that disability is the right term. I'm not sure. But different sort of perceptions of Blackness based on conditions, right? So maybe you could say a little bit about your conversations with folks with albinism and vitiligo.
Again, just trying to pushing us to think critically before you start creating this box and saying you got to look a certain way. You know, the story of Joanne, and what's interesting, all of the folks, there was a web that was created, right? I started doing this project before I even conceived of it as a book. I thought it was going to be a digital project. It was a website. And of course, I'm sharing things that I'm finding on my Facebook. At the time was where I was primarily on social media. And so folks would be like, yo, I have a cousin or yo, you should connect with so-and-so. I was going to interview Malcolm Gladwell. It didn't work out, but like just trying to connect me to folks. And so there's nobody in the book who I can't trace those connections back. So I was connected with this woman, Joanne. And Joanne, because again, I do work on skin bleaching, right? And when we talk about skin bleaching, everybody wants to throw Michael Jackson's name into the mix, right? But because I've done work on skin bleaching, I knew he didn't bleach his skin, right? Not in the ways that we may think about it, right? So let me say this. When you bleach your skin, you're using caustic chemicals to stop the production of melanin. Most of the people that I've seen and worked with across, Ghana, Jamaica, when you use those chemicals on your skin suffers. So you might
start to look gray. You start to look gray.
It don't
Yeah.
look right. Right.
Yeah.
And you get acne. There's all kinds of, stretch marks. There's all kinds of damage that you do to the skin. Because again, if you live in Jamaica, if you live in Ghana, you're living under the sun. The reason why our skin is black, the reason why we have the levels of melanin that we do is to protect us from the sun. It's a natural sunscreen of sorts. Not to say that we shouldn't wear sunscreen. Black people
Wear it.
Black only cracks if you don't wear sunscreen. Now look here. So looking at Michael Jackson, I always knew like that color doesn't come from, I mean, I know he got money, so he has access to other types of things, but that color doesn't come from skin bleaching. Michael told us he had vitiligo, and we didn't believe him because of the ways that we know vitiligo. I also included a sister by the name of Sembony who has vitiligo in the ways that we might imagine it, right? With the skin that has multiple colors, if you will. But what happened in the case of Joanne is what likely happened in the case of Michael Jackson. Her vitiligo, and vitiligo is an autoimmune disease whereby your system fights melanin. Like melanin is a danger to the body, so it fights it and stops its production to the extent that it literally leaves. Right, it's gone. Joanne lost all. Can you find her picture, please? Joanne lost all of her color. Joanne was browner than Suzanne. She lost all of her color. And in our interview, look at Joanne, y'all. And in the book, I also show her a picture, the second picture, she's holding a picture of herself. That's what Joanne used to look like. Joanne lost all of her melanin, except for one spot on her leg, which she showed me. So again, if we are going by what people look like, what are we saying? Joanne's not Black. So again, I'm just trying to, I'm just giving us some examples and some things to think about when we're defining Blackness. We have to go beyond appearances.
Right.
Right? Albinism, also lack of production of melanin. Right? Are they not Black? In fact, what would make them Black? If they don't look Black, what makes them Black? Well, for many of us, we know your mama Black, your daddy Black, stuff. You're raised Black, culturally you're Black. You have, what else would you be? Even though maybe somebody might look at you and say, well, you look white, you could be white. That's not how it works, right? And so we have to move beyond simplistic ideations of race that are just about what people look like. It's part of the reason why I'm glad that, at least for those of us who know better, using the language of Latinx, which is still not a race, but whatever. If we're looking at the census and you got check boxes, using Latinx rather than Hispanic. And shout out to my people from New York. I love y'all so much, but it's so interesting to me. They refer to everybody as Spanish. And so I remember going to Spain last summer, and I did a video and I'm like, I just want to remind y'all that Spain is in Europe. I am in Europe. I'm very clear that I'm in Europe. These Europeans who were also colonizers. The reason why folks are speaking Spanish is the same reason why y'all are speaking English. Y'all don't have no connection to the UK, but you're speaking the King's English, right? Spain is in Europe. Spanish people are white.
With that hard.
Right? So Spanish isn't the word that we should be using to describe people unless they come from Spain. They speak Spanish, but Spanish is spoken in lots of places, particularly where the Spanish colonized space. So what is a Latinx identity? What is a Hispanic identity? So when I lived in Miami, because I did a pre-doc at FIU, shout out to Fort Lauderdale. When I lived in Miami, I'm like, all these Spanish folk, Latino folks are J-Lo white. J-Lo light, right? But again, when we connect the dots, historically speaking, these are the Cubans who were able to escape the revolution. These are the Cubans who were privileged enough to leave. So when I go to Cuba, why come all the people are like me?
So again, if you go to Puerto Rico, you go down to Puerto Rico, everybody look like me and you.
Yeah. So again, even for myself, for as learned as I think I am, I can admit to you right now, I'm always taken aback when I see somebody, at the corner store, my complexion, speaking Spanish fluidly. It always just takes me a minute, like, okay, yes, all right, got it, right? Because that's not how Spanish is projected to us. It's not even how Latino is projected to us. Like, we assume that people look a particular way. And no different than the politics of mediated images with Black media, it's the same thing with Latinx media. Of course, J-Lo's gonna rise to the top, though she can't sing a lick. Of course she is.
Not a lick.
Because she makes you feel comfortable in your whiteness. She looks more like you. So she speaks Spanish too? Check. We got in a Latinx person.
Barely. I mean, her level and my level, but I feel you. Mm-hmm.
And so colorism works in that way across the board, right? But again, Spain is in Europe. They were colonizers. Yes, of course, you should expect to see folks who look like me who speak Spanish. Same with Brazil. Folks who speak Portuguese, yes, they look like us. There are more of us in the world than are not. But many of us, I should say, don't have an opportunity to explore the world in that way. And unfortunately, for those of us who do, sometimes we just stay on the resort. We won't really see how the people live in,
right.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, you and I could chop it up all night, obviously, but we have questions in the question box. So let's see.
Okay.
So this is from Tiffany King, who asks, Dr. Blay, as an academic, what are some of the specific challenges that make it so difficult to discuss colorism in the academy, specifically in Black studies / African American studies spaces? Come on, Dr. King. Okay, Dr. Blay.
What makes it difficult? I'm not sure. I think, when I think generally of the academy, people in position seats of power determine what's valuable enough for us to bring to a classroom. I have my degree is in Black studies. I can tell you that even though I graduated from the Blackest Black Studies program there were many folks who did not see the value in the work that I wanted to do. That somehow me focusing on skin bleaching, on colorism, particularly because I was focusing on women, that it wasn't as serious as, let's say, police brutality, right? That there's a sense of urgency for us to only look at particular things. And again, for me, we're having a multitude of experiences, and you cannot disconnect colorism from white supremacy. And so I don't have an answer as much as I think about the ways that even within our spaces, the ways that we put value on Black experiences, there are only certain Black experiences that we hold valuable enough to study. Somehow people make colorism a personal problem. That's just your choice. That's just your preference. That's individual. No, this is a reflection. Like, colorism is an instigator of white supremacy. How can we study white supremacy and not think about colorism? And colorism isn't just like we talk about colorism on some like crabs in the barrel type stuff. This isn't just us. White people they're colorists, since that's the language people are using now. White people are colorists now. There's a difference how they see Susanna and how they see me, even though we're not that far off the spectrum, at least I don't think. Right? There's a difference when you think about it. And I don't see, I shouldn't even do this. But when you think about Black television historically, what have the TV mamas look like? What have the families look like? What have the children look like? See, I'm the person, when I watch Lovecraft Country, I want the backstory. You got to tell me why. What was Journey Small?
Ruby and Letty
and the brother. So
yep. What's the story? I want the story too.
It has to be. Black people not gonna let that go. Something happened. You got a different daddy. Something is happening because within our families we can have different colors, but both of y'all are very brown, and your sister is very light. Tell us the backstory, or Queen Sugar. Now we get the backstory there, but there's a difference between the lived experience of the two brown siblings and the light one.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, there's no you know. And so like colorism permeates so many of our experiences, but we don't want to name it. Because then we would have to be accountable for the ways in which we are agents of white supremacy. We don't want to own that. We only want to talk about white people and what white people do. And everything is them, it's them, it's them. What about us? You think there's not going to be an impact of white supremacy after all these generations of living with it? You think we're not going to take that on? You think we're not going to internalize that? You don't think we're going to project that onto ourselves? Of course we are. We don't want to be held accountable because we want to hold the flame to white people exclusively. We're going to have to burn ourselves.
Ooh, it's low-hanging fruit. Then you're going to have to look and see, why does that professor or scholar or person or writer who's blackity black, 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 always with super duper light-skinned people, always chasing white women or chasing white men or chasing white non-black, whatever the gender is, but chasing whiteness and chasing light bright, we can't.
Or who are our Black public intellectuals? Who gets to speak on our behalf? Who was our Black president? Who is our Black vice president? What they look like? Who you comfortable with? Just a question. Just wondering. Just wondering if there's any connection.
It's so provocative. And it's, and I'm not an ADOS person because technically I literally can't be, even if I wanted to be. However, I think it's also interesting that neither of them have deep roots in the United States, too.
I mean, because again, within white supremacy, within that spectrum, whiteness at the top, blackness at the bottom, those of us who are coming from the diaspora, those of us who are all of us, everybody's fighting to be the model minority. No, I'm not Black because people conflate Black with American. No, I'm not Black. I'm Kenyan. No, I'm not Black. I'm from this place. I'm not like those regular folks who come from enslavement. My people have always been free, right? We play, again, agents of white supremacy. We play the game too. We all have to dismantle white supremacy, but we got to work with the white supremacists that live within us.
That's real.
I don't even know if I answered your question, sis, but that's what I got.
So we're going to go to the next question. This is by Edward Austin Hall. Because of my appearance, I've spent my life confusing people of every race about my own ancestry. Sometimes when people ask me politely, I'm happy to be forthcoming. Sometimes I am not. Have any advice on this front? Not so much for me, but for making a perhaps more civil society around race and ethnicity. And he adds, I should add that I identify as Black, Creole, African American, no/hyphen, mixed race, a person of color, and American.
And so tell me the question, what's the question part?
The question is, any advice on like when people are like, so if you're racially ambiguous and folks are like, so what are you really? And they want to have that conversation about ancestry. He says it's not really so much for him because he's navigating it, but for making a more civil society around race and ethnicity. How do we have those conversations?
Yeah, I might be the wrong person to ask. I don't know how we have civil conversations around race when somebody is inserting themselves into your lived experience and essentially asking you to explain yourself. Like, again, and I don't have this experience, so I'm not trying to project, but I imagine I would feel some type of way. Like, who are you to ask me anything? What do you need this information for? And again, that's why I said you might not want to listen to me on that. What do you think, Susanna?
I think it's interesting because, so much of this trying to figure out who a person is racially, and I think gender-wise too, is then I get to figure out how I'm going to treat them. It becomes a shorthand. And how about you just treat people respectfully, period? You know what I mean? And I feel like I stopped a long time ago trying to figure out who a person was, right? And I think as a queer person, it's been helpful to be like, untethering gender expression from gender and all those kinds of things. It's like, do you have good sense? Are you projecting good sense? Are you going to interact with me with, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish. I'm just saying, like, you don't know what my gender is by looking at me. Yes, I am clearly a Black person, but you actually don't know how I move through the world as a Black person. I could be a Daniel Cameron. I don't have to be an Angela Davis. I could be a whole idiot. Don't let the locks fool you, right? So taking a look at someone's body and trying to be like, oh, well, she has natural hair and this means this, So I think, but also I'm not racially ambiguous. So I don't know. I may be the wrong person as well, because I think, why do we necessarily want to have a civil conversation? Sometimes we should be uncivil.
Well, you know what it's making
That's
me
not always helpful.
It's making me think of in this moment, and we've all had way too many Zoom calls, but I like meetings, regular meetings, and part of the process when folks introduce themselves is to also introduce their pronouns. Now, I don't know if it's fair to make some level of comparison, or I'm just thinking about the question. Should we have to announce who we are and how we want to be seen?
Again, I think,
I'm wondering, part of the purpose of announcing your pronouns and your gender identity is so that people can respect that and speak to you accordingly. Yes? Would we have to do the same thing with race? And would it be enough? Because who's questioning? If you say my pronouns are they, them, I'm not going to be like, well, how'd you get to that? Why come?
Well, some people might, but yeah, you're right.
Really?
Yeah. People are ignorant.
So it's hard to imagine what a quote unquote civil conversation, because as you say, people are ignorant, and sometimes people don't know how to just read the room and stop talking to me,
Right.
But I'm definitely open to what folks think about that, because again, I think I would be offended if somebody asked me, but again, I've never had the experience, so it's hard to say. But as you said, what do you need this in? Like, you want to treat me different? What you need to know? Or you just curious? Right. You don't recognize that you invading my space?
Right.
You recognize that I don't owe you anything?
Right.
But
we're not at the zoo. Like, you don't need a placard to figure out who I am. We're not at the zoo, And
sometimes curiosity is annoying. Curious for the purpose of what? Like, it's one thing to have a particular type of curiosity that's going to motivate you to go find your own answers and, I don't know, Google some things, go to a library, figure it out. And sometimes curiosity is literally because you just had the question and you didn't have a filter to know not to ask it. Right. Because what's going to change now that you have the answer?
Questions. Oh, okay. We have more questions here. Brandy asks, I've seen some scholarly positions on race not being a thing or real, that is racecraft, specifically scientifically. How do we thread the needle in talking about the positionality of Blackness in the context of race as a construction?
Y'all got smart questions.
Yes, come on, Brandy. And thanks, Ed, for that previous question. Thanks to Ed.
So give me the two parts that we're trying to thread a needle between.
So Brandy is saying that she's seen scholarly positions that say race is not a biological fact, but she's asking, how do we thread the needle in talking about the positionality of Blackness in the context of race as a construction? So it's not real, but it matters.
I mean, it's not real, but it matters. And even what does real mean? Like, how are we defining real? The fact that it impacts my life makes it very real. And it seems like a very, I don't know, it's a privilege to say it's not real. Like, we're supposed to move on because you said it's not real. What's that mean? Not real for who? So, okay, yes, the paper says it's not real, but does that change my lived experience? If the president of the United States gets up on the TV and says, all right, everybody, race is not real, let's move on, what's going to change? Right? And so for me, I feel like, I don't know. And again, it's me. What is useful in terms of information. We should know that this is not real. And then what? So to say it's not real means that we also have to dig very deeply into the idea of race as a social construct for us to understand just how insidious white supremacy is. Because understand, you cannot disconnect the construction of race from white supremacy. There was no other reason to even come up with race if not for white supremacy. These folks defined whiteness as pure and defined everything else in relation to whiteness. Whiteness has always been the center of these conversations. So we can't act like it's just a biological fact, that it just came from somewhere. It was constructed with a particular political agenda.
Right.
And so I don't even know if I answered the question. That's what I got.
Thank you for that question, Brandy. All right. We have a couple questions about resources. So Chelsea asks, I'm a high school biology teacher. Do you have recommendations for, well, sort of connected to the previous question, do you have recommendations for resources to use for teaching students about the history of how, why racial categories were created? So books, links, podcasts, websites.
It's hard to say, y'all. Like I got a PhD so that I could teach adults, so that I could curse in class and such. I honor all of y'all who teach children. It takes a particular
Doing God's work. Yeah.
it takes a particular level of patience, but it's hard to say because people are so prickly when it comes to what children are able to receive. You know, like I have a granddaughter who's now 7, and I remember, not last year because of COVID, year before last, I went to pick her up from school right before Thanksgiving holiday, and she comes out of the school with one of those construction crowns with feathers, talking about they were learning about pilgrims and Indians. You know, the teacher got an email, right? That's what we doing in 2019, right? But again, in that K through 12 environment, there are actually not a lot of spaces that teach students differently. You know, it's like this long history of teaching the same thing. And so it's not until somebody comes and tells you that it's a problem that you try to create new language for it. So it's hard to say and advise. I even think about it when I was, for example, raising my daughter and trying to talk to her about sex. I was talking to her about sex, not birds and bees and where do babies come from, storks and stuff. We were talking about penises and vaginas and fertilization, because I think in a lot of ways, that doesn't help our children to not tell them particular truths. But also, I was her parent, so I made that decision, right? Had I had that conversation with my godson, his mother would not be here for it. That's not how she does, you know? So all of that to say, I don't know of resources that speak specifically to a particular age group. The youngest I've taught in those ways have probably been high school, you know, and many of them were sharp enough to read the things that I would share with my students. But if you read the book, you can definitely check all of the notes and citations that I use. But also for me, I remember when I was teaching, it was very rare that there was any one book that I would use, right? Lots of articles and chapters and such. So I'm sorry that I don't have anything clearer. But again, the question is for me, I'm wondering I don't know what y'all are allowed to do. You know what I mean?
Right.
You teach other people's children. So I'm not sure how much you're able, you know, to say and to teach, because for me, it all comes back to white supremacy and the problematics of whiteness. We're really going to talk about race, you know?
Right. Well, I know our Auburn Avenue research librarian is dropping all kind of knowledge in the chat, so definitely, and that will be available afterwards. My other twin, Alexa Encarnacion, is in the chat. She teaches high school, and she is recommending "Race: The Power of an Illusion," and she says that's a good doc. So check that out. I trust Alexa with everything. So
I own that. It is a good doc. Thank you for that, Alexa. It's true.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that question. Okay, we have a couple more before we let you go off into the night. All right, so Robin Boylorn, my crunk sister, asked, based on your interviews and research, how does class and/or classism inform how Blackness is culturally and publicly constructed?
Intertwined, right? Again, speaking to folks, you know, the thing is, for many of them, it's a couple things happening, right? So there are folks who recognize the privilege that comes with their appearance. They recognize the privilege that they've had access to and how their lives may have been different should they have looked like another family member. They recognize that and in some ways seek to push back. So they're the ones who are going to announce that they're Black. Whatever it is you think about me, right? Know that I am Black. But then there are others who aren't able to recognize right? The privilege, because for them, they're Black and they're not white. Because again, how are we constructing Blackness? If Black is not white, then that automatically means that you don't have privilege. But again, when we have this colorism conversation, particularly when we look at the history, right? We can literally map it out, which Blacks were seen as more, based on their approximation to Blackness, who was safer, who could we trust, who, like, literally looking at people and say, well, you have white in your family, so that makes you more human. And in that way, the privilege that comes with their appearance automatically lifts their status in society. When we look at the history of HBCUs, y'all, which schools let in which people? Some of their applications, let me tell you this. I wrote an article called Pretty Color and Good Hair, and I talk a little bit about this in the introduction. I'm not going to name no names, but some HBCUs, brown paper bag tests were real. Comb tests were real. You had to supply not only a portrait of yourself, but a portrait of your parents in order to apply to the school. So again, we love our HBCUs, no doubt. We talk about them in a particular way in this moment, but historically, many of them were essentially finishing schools. Some of them, I should say, the more elite ones were for a particular class of the Blacks. And then you have your A&Ts and technical schools and such that were to give us a trade. And if you look at the difference between those graduating classes, there is absolutely a color line. Absolutely a color line there. So we cannot take capitalism, we can't take class out of the conversation. There are hard lines generationally when it comes to skin color, I think.
Thank you, Robin, for that question. And we have one final question. We sort of talked a little bit about this, but I think you have more to say. This is from Karis. Do you see any useful resonances between people who resist or confound the gender binary and people who do not fit neatly into our conceptions of Black or white?
Do I find any
resonances, useful resonances between people who resist or confound the gender binary and people who do not neatly fit into our conceptions of Black or white? Any useful resonances between the sort of gender fuck and folks who are out here confounding people based on their racial ambiguity?
I don't, it's hard to say because I'm not as well versed in terms of folks who resist the binary in terms of gender and the languaging that they might use. So maybe you can help me with this, Susanna. You have any thoughts real quick that I can?
I think that there are useful resonances there, but it also, I think that there are also some limitations with which I think your text is inviting us to reconsider the language that we use around race and to speak more robustly around this. And like folks in the chat jump in, but I feel like those of us queer folks, and I identify as cis, so I can't be nobody's spokesperson for being gender nonconforming. But I feel like in queer communities, in trans communities and non-binary communities, folks are kind of doing that work, and that resisting language is being built up and has been there for generations. And what you're asking us to do in terms of thinking of Blackness is like go back to square one and be like, how do we understand ourselves?
Sure.
Right? It's about self-determination. So I do think there are useful resonances there. But I feel like in some of the ways that we talk about race, like going back to one of my first questions about gatekeeping, we're still doing some kind of basic stuff around race. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's just my take as a cis person. I am not an expert, you know? But I'd be interested to hear what folks who identify differently, feel.
To be honest, part of the reason why I think I hesitated to even touch the question, because hearing the question, I immediately thought of Rachel Dolezal's excuse, which
and the
is that
transracial. Yeah.
Transracial,
It's problematic.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
So,
and like reducing people's experience, it's not necessarily neatly parallel. And someone's saying something similar in the chat, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they're not parallel. So it makes me uncomfortable to try and draw those lines. And honestly, I'm not sure that we need to. I don't need to compare those things because, again, none of this is clean cut, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it could just be me. I might need a minute to think about it, just because of the case of a Rachel Dolezal and even coming up with that language. I remember when she first said it, I was like, this.
Yeah, yeah. And there are folks who are confounding racial categories and gender categories, right? And so they have to speak to their own experience. So, yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either. I don't know
Yeah.
either.
But thank you for the question, Karis. I think that was at ER. I'm not sure who was asking the question from the bookstore. Any other questions before we let Yaba go? Yesterday was pub day, and I know you have other places to be to talk about this book, and there'll be other questions. So I really want to thank you for, being with us this evening. Thank you to everybody in the chat asking really challenging questions, thought-provoking things.
Thank you to Auburn for all of these resources. I'm gonna have to scroll back up and see what y'all
so many resources. Thanks to the high school educators asking the good questions.
For sure.
All of that.
I think that is part of the work, right? That if you are a high school educator or an elementary educator, maybe that's part of the work, is trying to figure out how we begin to have honest conversations earlier, because I continue to have the experience. I know you have this experience, Susanna. They get to your classroom and the whole world is turned upside down. Everything they done learned has been a lie. And I just wish there was a way to teach more truthfully before you get to a college classroom. People
are doing the work.
Yeah.
And you're part of that constellation of folks. So we appreciate you.
Thank you, friend.